It began with a sealed instruction buried deep inside a Windsor Trust vault documents tied to Prince Philip that were never meant to resurface until 2040. Yet, in early 2026, trustees quietly reopened the file. What they revealed sent shockwaves through Clarence House. Queen Camilla was reportedly completely blindsided, and at the center of the revelation was an unexpected name: Lady Louise Windsor. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Inside the quiet machinery of Windsor's most restricted archival division, where even the sound of paper turning is treated like a breach of protocol, trustees began what was supposed to be a standard verification of estate continuity tied to the legacy of Prince Philip. Nothing about the initial mandate suggested disruption. Yet as layers of sealed indexing were peeled back, an anomaly emerged: an annexed codex reference that did not match any publicly cataloged inheritance record. It was marked in a classification system long associated with Philip's most private reflections, a system used only in the final years of his life, when correspondence was no longer meant for immediate royal circulation. As archivists cross-checked timestamps and legal seals, the atmosphere in the room shifted from procedural calm to controlled alarm. Reports suggest that multiple internal protocols were triggered simultaneously, forcing a halt in the review process while senior trustees were summoned without delay. It was during this frozen interval that the name Lady Louise Windsor first appeared, not as a passing mention, but as a structured reference embedded within interpretive commentary attributed to Philip's personal diary codex. The discovery did not carry legal authority, yet its symbolic weight was immediate and unsettling. Within Clarence House, early notifications were issued to select advisory circles, though details were deliberately withheld, fueling speculation rather than clarity. Some insiders described the reaction as unusually restrained on the surface, yet deeply reactive beneath it, as if the implications were understood without needing confirmation. Whispers began circulating through palace-adjacent channels that Lady Louise had been singled out, in a manner that suggested continuity symbolism rather than direct inheritance, a distinction that only intensified curiosity and concern. Queen Camilla's circle, according to those familiar with internal briefings, was alerted late, and with minimal context, creating a vacuum that was quickly filled by interpretation, fear, and fragmented assumptions. Even within the broader administrative corridors of the monarchy, where confidentiality is not just expected but enforced, staff reportedly sensed an unusual urgency in how communication was being restricted, as though containment itself had become the priority. What made the moment more destabilizing was not just the content of the discovery, but the fact that it emerged from a document thought to be sealed beyond the reach of current governance structures. In that uneasy intersection between memory and authority, between what was written long ago and what still governs today, the monarchy found itself facing a question it was not prepared to answer. But the diary was not just a reflection of the past, it was a map pointing toward a future succession struggle no one was prepared for. The sealed diary of Prince Philip was never intended to be part of public record, stored alongside restricted Royal Collection Trust archives and private correspondence tied to Balmoral summers. It carried the weight of decades of private reflections. Yet trustees now suggest the diary contained coded references to inheritance philosophy. References that quietly reshaped how assets like Sandringham and Windsor would be viewed in the long term. For years, the document remained locked under one of the most controlled classifications within the Royal Collection Trust, accessible only through layered authorization, codes and trustee consensus protocols designed to prevent even accidental exposure. It was placed in the same category as sensitive estate correspondence connected to Balmoral and Sandringham. Estates long treated not merely as residences but as symbolic anchors of continuity within the monarchy. The diary itself, according to archival notes, was believed to have been compiled during Prince Philip's final years of service, a period when reflection replaced duty yet still carried the structure of institutional thinking. What makes the discovery so unsettling is not just its existence, but its tone. Reports suggest it contained recurring philosophical fragments centered on generational duty over entitlement, a phrase now circulating quietly through internal channels with growing significance. Within these entries, trustees reportedly identified subtle references to younger members of the royal family, not in direct naming at first, but through coded language describing endurance, restraint, and unspoken responsibility. These symbolic markers, once decoded, appeared to align with individuals positioned outside immediate lines of visible succession, creating interpretive tension among those reviewing the material. The diary's archival tagging explicitly marked it non-release until trustee consensus, a safeguard intended to keep its contents from influencing living governance structures. Yet that safeguard itself is now being questioned, as internal suspicion grows that the document may have already shaped unseen conversations about legacy and continuity long before it was reopened. Some interpretations emerging from within advisory circles suggest that Philip's reflections were not passive recollections, but deliberate philosophical framing of what royal inheritance should represent in a modern constitutional monarchy. This has led to quiet unease as the boundary between personal thought ninth institutional influence begins to blur in ways the archive system was never designed to handle. Even more striking is the way references to estates like Windsor and Sandringham are no longer viewed purely as property markers, but as symbolic instruments within a broader narrative of duty, sacrifice, and long-term stewardship. As trustees continue to examine the layers of meaning embedded within the text, a growing realization is taking hold. The diary may not simply describe the monarchy as it was, but subtly question what it should become. However, what remained hidden inside those pages would only matter once the living began interpreting the dead. Inside the decoded sections of Prince Philip's sealed diary, trustees reportedly found repeated references to one unexpected figure, Lady Louise Windsor. Not in titles, but in coded remarks about continuity of duty and unspoiled royal temperament. For Queen Camilla, those interpretations were reportedly described in Palace Whispers as deeply destabilizing, especially given the implications for influence over future royal narratives. What began as a quiet archival clarification quickly evolved into something far more sensitive, as trustees traced line after line of Philip's reflective annotations and began noticing a consistent pattern that could not be easily dismissed as coincidence. Lady Louise Windsor appeared not as a subject of direct instruction, but as a recurring symbol embedded in language describing restraint, discipline, and the absence of public excess. The phrase "discipline without spotlight" stood out repeatedly in internal reviews, described by archivists as unusually deliberate in tone, almost like a philosophical marker rather than a casual remark. Within the rigid structures of royal documentation, such phrasing carries weight far beyond sentiment. It becomes interpretive material, something that can subtly shape how future custodians of legacy are viewed. Trustees, working under strict confidentiality frameworks, reportedly began to question whether these references were accidental reflections or carefully considered ideals meant to survive beyond Philip's lifetime. The more they compared these notes to broader patterns within royal estate philosophy, the more the idea of unspoiled royal temperament began to stand apart as a defining theme, one that seemed to contrast sharply with the increasingly public-facing nature of modern monarchy. In parallel, unease began to grow within Queen Camilla's advisory environment, where the implications of such interpretations were not viewed as academic curiosity, but as potential narrative disruption. If certain members of the younger generation were being symbolically elevated within legacy documents tied to Prince Philip, even indirectly, then the balance of perception within the institution risked shifting in subtle but powerful ways. Camilla's household advisors, according to internal accounts, began questioning whether these coded references were ever intended to be interpreted in the present tense at all, or whether trustees were projecting meaning onto reflective private thoughts. Yet the very act of interpretation had already taken hold, and once such ideas enter palace circulation, they rarely remain contained. Comparisons started forming quietly between Philip's traditional ideals of service and the modern pressures placed upon public-facing royals, creating a tension between inherited expectation and evolving identity. Lady Louise's name, once peripheral in official discourse, was now being discussed in cautious tones as a symbolic reference point for a quieter form of monarchy, one rooted in duty rather than visibility. This subtle shift did not go unnoticed within circles concerned about reputational equilibrium, where even symbolic elevation can be perceived as political imbalance. The result was not open conflict, but a growing sense of instability beneath the surface, where interpretation itself became a battleground of meaning, influence, and legacy control. But interpretation quickly turned into confrontation once the trustees decided the document could no longer remain silent. In a tightly controlled meeting involving Royal Collection Trust trustees and senior legal custodians, the decision was made. Portions of Prince Philip's sealed diary would be formally acknowledged within internal royal governance channels. The announcement reportedly left Queen Camilla visibly stunned. Even more controversial was the formal mention of Lady Louise Windsor as part of a legacy-linked interpretive clause. The meeting itself, according to internal accounts, was not marked by drama in tone, but by something far more unsettling precision. Held within the fortified legal corridors of Windsor's Archival Administration Wing, it brought together trustees who had spent years safeguarding documents never meant to re-enter the living structure of royal decision-making. Yet this time, the language of circa attainment shifted. What had once been locked under absolute confidentiality was now being reclassified into a controlled disclosure framework, allowing selected fragments of Prince Philip's sealed diary to enter restricted royal governance circulation. The shift was described by some insiders as procedural but irreversible, a phrase that carried more weight than any formal announcement. Because within royal systems, procedure is never just process, it is authority in motion. Camilla's advisory circle, notably absent from the initial briefing phase, only learned of the development after internal authorization had already been granted. That delay, though officially justified under classification protocols, immediately sparked quiet concern within palace networks, where timing often signals intent as much as content. When Queen Camilla was finally briefed, sources describe her reaction as controlled on the surface, yet visibly unsettled beneath it, not because of the diary's existence, but because of what had been formally appended to its interpretation. Lady Louise Windsor's name, once distant from such high-level archival frameworks, had been inserted into what was now being referred to internally as the Legacy Continuity Appendix. This was not a claim of inheritance, nor a directive of succession, but a symbolic categorization that linked her presence to long-term interpretive readings of royal duty. Within hours, the reaction across palace administrative layers was described as procedurally unprecedented. Not due to public exposure, but because internal governance channels had been activated without the customary equilibrium between advisory factions. Security protocols around archival circulation were immediately tightened, restricting access to a smaller circle of authorized custodians. The atmosphere shifted from administrative routine to controlled alertness, as though the document itself had become a sensitive instrument rather than a historical record. Whispered concern began to circulate regarding an emerging imbalance between interpretive authority and advisory oversight, especially as different factions began to question how meaning was being assigned rather than merely recorded. What made the moment more destabilizing was the absence of any external crisis. There was no public scandal, no visible rupture, only an internal recalibration unfolding behind closed doors, where influence is measured not by declarations, but by what is allowed to be acknowledged. The inclusion of Lady Louise Windsor in such a clause did not alter law, yet it altered perception, and in royal dynamics, perception often precedes consequence. As trustees stepped back from the table and the meeting dissolved into controlled silence, one reality became unmistakable. Something fundamental inside the monarchy's interpretive structure had shifted. What followed was not public chaos but a silent recalibration of power inside the monarchy itself. As the implication of the sealed diary spread through internal channels, King Charles III reportedly found himself at the center of a deeply uncomfortable divide. On one side stood institutional trustees defending Prince Philip's legacy, on the other, concerns from Queen Camilla's advisory circle. The question was no longer about interpretation, it was about whether legacy documents could quietly influence living succession dynamics. The briefing delivered to King Charles III under the confidential Red Box Priority Protocol was not presented as a crisis. yet its tone carried the unmistakable weight of institutional tension. These briefings, typically reserved for matters of constitutional sensitivity or national urgency, rarely include archival reinterpretations. But the sealed diary of Prince Philip had now crossed an invisible boundary from historical record into active governance concern. As Charles reviewed the material, sources suggest the atmosphere around him was described as unusually restrained. Ed, as if every word required careful internal calculation before acknowledgment. Because what was being discussed was no longer just what Philip had written, but what those words now meant in the present structure of royal authority. The divide emerged almost immediately. Trustees, positioned as guardians of historical integrity, insisted the diary remained non-binding but historically guiding, a phrase that seemed simple on the surface yet carried deep interpretive consequence. In their view, Prince Philip's reflections were not instructions, but philosophical anchors, principles meant to inform continuity rather than dictate outcomes. However, within Camilla's advisory circle, the concern was less abstract. Requests for clarification began to focus on symbolic implications, particularly how interpretations of legacy language might be reshaping perceptions of influence within the institution. The unease was not about legality, but about narrative gravity, who is seen as aligned with continuity and who is not. As these competing interpretations circulated, a more sensitive concern began to surface within palace discussions. Perception. Not official succession rules, but the far more volatile terrain of how succession is felt by those within and outside the institution. Trustees warned that suppressing interpretive findings could damage transparency and erode trust in archival governance. Yet others feared that too much openness could destabilize the careful balance between tradition and present authority. In this environment, even neutrality became a position, and every decision risked being read as alignment with one faction or another. It was in this climate that concerns about perceived favoritism toward younger royals began to surface quietly, not as accusation, but as anxiety and awareness that symbolic readings of Philip's words could unintentionally shift emotional weight within the royal narrative. Through it all, King Charles was described as being caught in an increasingly delicate convergence of responsibility and restraint. On one side lay institutional duty, rooted in safeguarding the monarchy's long memory. On the other, the immediate pressure of maintaining unity within his own household and advisory structure. Those close to the situation reportedly described his position as a balance with no stable center, where every attempt to resolve tension risked amplifying it elsewhere. The diary itself, though sealed in origin, had become an open question in practice, its meaning no longer contained by ink and paper, but expanded through interpretation, debate, and internal projection. And the more it was analyzed, the more it seemed to resist closure, as if its true influence was not in what it said, but in what it forced others to confront about authority, legacy, and control. And as the king hesitated, other royal forces began to move with quiet precision. Behind palace walls, senior figures including Princess Anne and Prince Edward remain. They reportedly initiated what insiders called an institutional correction response. Without directly challenging the trustees, they began reinforcing procedural authority over how legacy documents could be interpreted. The goal was clear: prevent the sealed diary of Prince Philip from becoming a political instrument inside modern royal dynamics. What unfolded was not confrontation, but calibration, quiet, deliberate, and executed with the precision of long-practiced constitutional instinct. Princess Anne, often described within internal circles as the monarchy's most uncompromising guardian of discipline, reportedly moved first. Her focus was not on the content of Prince Philip's sealed diary, but on the framework surrounding its interpretation. She reinforced archival governance discipline protocols, tightening the language around how historical documents could be referenced in advisory discussions. To her, the danger was never the diary itself, but the way meaning could be stretched beyond ninth intent until it began influencing living structure. At the same time, Prince Edward engaged legal advisors in parallel channels, focusing on documentation boundaries and procedural limits. His approach was quieter, more technical, but equally decisive. Discussions centered on how far trustees could go in assigning interpretive, weight to historical reflections without crossing into perceived governance influence. Within these exchanges, the concept of containment by definition began to take shape, an attempt to ensure that legacy material remained anchored to history, not present-day positioning. It was a subtle but firm reminder that archives inform the monarchy, they do not direct it. As these parallel efforts aligned, senior royals reportedly reaffirmed what insiders refer to as the heirs' accord, an informal but deeply respected understanding that continuity must always override reinterpretation. It was not a written law, but a stabilizing principle, one that ensures the monarch why does not fracture under competing narratives of legacy. In this renewed alignment, emphasis was placed on continuity over reinterpretation, a deliberate recalibration meant to prevent symbolic readings of Prince Philip's diary from being treated as directional guidance rather than reflective thought. Within internal messaging systems, a clear shift began to emerge. Language became more restrained, more procedural, and far more guarded. References to the diary were stripped of emotional framing and replaced with administrative terminology designed to limit speculative interpretation. This shift also had an immediate ripple effect within Queen Camilla's advisory discussions, where influence was reportedly curtailed not through direct exclusion, but through narrowed access to interpretive channels. The adjustment was subtle but unmistakable: less visibility, fewer inputs, and a more controlled flow of information. Behind it all, the palace bureaucracy shifted into what insiders describe as strict document containment mode. Not suppression, but stabilization. Every reference point connected to the sealed diary was now treated as a potential interpretive risk, requiring layered approval before circulation. Yet even as these systems tightened, a quiet tension lingered beneath the surface. Because while procedural authority was being reinforced with precision, the meaning already released into internal consciousness could not be fully recalled. The institution had regained control of the framework, but not entirely of the narrative it had already sparked. And in that fragile balance between control and interpretation, the monarchy found itself standing on ground that felt steady only in appearance. But containment was no longer possible. The narrative had already escaped into the corridors of power. As the implications of Prince Philip's sealed diary spread further, Queen Camilla reportedly found herself increasingly isolated within internal advisory circles. While no formal action was taken against her, palace insiders describe a quiet distancing effect. Meanwhile, the symbolic elevation of Lady Louise Windsor in interpretive discussions began reshaping subtle perceptions within the broader royal ecosystem. What made this shift so striking was not any official announcement, but the gradual reconfiguration of access, tone, and trust inside the machinery of the monarchy. Camilla's advisory circle, once closely integrated into sensitive interpretive discussions, began noticing a narrowing corridor of influence. It was not exclusion in a dramatic sense, but something far more controlled and harder to challenge: selective participation. Meetings that once included broad advisory input were now filtered through tighter procedural gates, where only specific voices were invited to weigh in on matters linked to legacy interpretation. The effect was subtle but unmistakable. Presence remained, but authority felt increasingly conditional. At the same time, the discourse surrounding Lady Louise Windsor began to take on an unexpected symbolic weight within internal conversations. Her name appeared more frequently not in formal succession contexts, but in reflective discussions about continuity, temperament, and the long-term identity of the monarchy. This was not framed as elevation, yet the repetition itself created resonance. Within palace ecosystems, repetition is never neutral, it becomes perception. And perception, once formed, begins to influence how roles are subconsciously mapped within institutional thinking. What started as interpretive mentions slowly evolved into a reference point, shaping how certain advisors spoke about balance, restraint, and the quieter architecture of royal duty. As this narrative tension developed, fractures began to appear in the alignment between trustees and Queen Camilla's advisory environment. The disagreement was not openly declared, but expressed through procedural friction, delays in briefings, revised circulation chains, and increasingly formalized communication pathways. Each adjustment deepened the sense that trust was being redistributed, not removed, but carefully reallocated. Within this shifting structure, King Charles was repeatedly urged to stabilize internal narrative cohesion, a phrase that in practice meant preventing symbolic interpretation from hardening into factional division. His position became increasingly complex, as he was required to hold together competing interpretations of legacy while maintaining the appearance of unified institutional direction. Simultaneously, sensitivity around language began to intensify across royal staff networks. Words connected to the diary, interpretation, or symbolic framing were treated with heightened caution, as if even informal commentary could tip internal balance. Staff were instructed to avoid speculation entirely, reinforcing a culture of disciplined silence where meaning was allowed to exist only within approved channels. Yet, despite these efforts, the atmosphere continued to shift. The more tightly communication was controlled, the more significant even small signals became as silence itself began to carry implication. And yet, beneath the silence, a final reckoning of meaning was already taking shape. In the end, the sealed diary of Prince Philip did not rewrite history through force, but through interpretation. What began as archival review ended as institutional reflection. For Queen Camilla, the moment became a symbolic setback. For Lady Louise Windsor, it became an unexpected elevation into legacy conversation. And for the monarchy, it reaffirmed one enduring truth: memory itself is power. What the trustees finalized was not a legal transformation, but something far more subtle and arguably more enduring: a carefully constructed interpretive framework that redefined how fragments of Prince Philip's sealed reflections would be understood within internal governance circles. There were no changes to succeed. SSE on law, no amendments to titles, and no formal redistribution of authority. Yet within the architecture of perception, something undeniably shifted. The monarchy, often perceived as rigid and immovable, revealed once again that its most powerful movements are not written in legislation, but shaped in narrative. Every line attributed to the late Duke began to function less as historical commentary and more as interpretive influence, a lens through which continuity itself was quietly reassessed. For Queen Camilla, the implications were complex and deeply political in tone. While her institutional position remained intact and structurally stable, the atmosphere surrounding her influence became noticeably more cautious. Decisions were no longer framed with the same ease of interpretive alignment, and advisory discussions began to reflect a heightened sensitivity around perception. It was not resistance, but recalibration. A reminder that within the royal ecosystem, stability is not just about holding position. It is about how that position is perceived when legacy narratives begin to shift around it. Her standing remained secure, yet the environment around it had undeniably changed, demanding a more measured, more carefully navigated presence in the ongoing conversation of monarchy and memory. In contrast, Lady Louise Windsor found herself increasingly present within symbolic discourse, not through promotion or declaration, but through association. The language surrounding her name evolved into something broader than biography. It became conceptual. Within internal discussions, she was increasingly referenced as a continuity symbol, a phrase that carried no official authority but considerable interpretive weight. It reflected a monarchy searching for balance between visibility and restraint, between modern presence and traditional understatement. The diary's interpretive echo, however indirect, had placed her within a narrative of understated continuity that some read as reflective of Prince Philip's enduring philosophical influence on royal identity. Meanwhile, King Charles III reasserted institutional neutrality with deliberate firmness, seeking to stabilize the shifting interpretive landscape without allowing any single narrative to define the monarchy's direction. His position required constant balancing between historical guardianship and present-day cohesion, between advisory caution and internal expectation. Alongside him, Princess Anne and Prince Edward reinforced procedural dominance, ensuring that governance structures remained the final authority over interpretation. Their actions were not reactive but corrective, designed to restore equilibrium where narrative momentum had begun to outpace institutional control. Gradually, the palace succeeded in restoring a form of narrative containment, not by erasing interpretation, but by reasserting procedural clarity around it. Internal communications were tightened, advisory flows stabilized, and the language of legacy once again anchored within controlled frameworks. Yet even in this restored order, nothing returned to its previous stillness. Because once interpretation enters the bloodstream of an institution like the monarchy, it does not disappear, it settles, reshapes, and lingers beneath every future decision. Because in the House of Windsor, even the dead do not remain silent, and every sealed page eventually finds someone willing to read it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.